Good morning and welcome back to the ASA conference for 2022. I think we all missed each other. Well, most of us missed each other, I would have thought. But it's great to be back here once again in the Lyrath. I was here yesterday evening. It was like a building site, so well done to everybody who has put this fabulous stage together for this year's conference, which, of course, as we know, for those of us that have been coming to the ASA for years, it is certainly a highlight in the social and academic calendar every year. And we've missed it for the last couple of years, so it's really great to see everybody back here again for the President's big day. And it is a big day. We have a lot of special guests, some from abroad, that are here with us, and they are going to, I suppose, share their wisdom with us, because we are, it goes without saying, we are on the cusp of monumental change in the business that we're all involved in, which is farming and agriculture and the environment. And it's concentrating minds at every single conference that we go to now, the issue of sustainability and climate targets. And I suppose you could say that there is just one question that we all have at these events, and it's one question that's on the lips of farmers and everybody in the industry, and that is how? How do we reach the 2030 target? How can technology make a difference? How can I, as a farmer, improve the carbon footprint on my farm? And that's the focus of this year's conference, where we have a number of speakers and presentations throughout the day, which will try and answer some of those questions as to how. So without further ado, let me introduce to you now for his opening address and sort of his closing one as well, the President of the ASA, George Ramsbottom.
Thank you very much, Damien, for that introduction. Friends, colleagues, and fellow ag scientists, it's with great pleasure that I welcome you here today to our annual conference at the Lyrath Hotel in Kilkenny. In planning the event, we weren't actually sure if the event would actually take place, and to be honest, we weren't sure what the environmental regulations were going to be. With both of those, we now have a much clearer picture of where we stand today, particularly in terms of the reduction targets in terms of emissions that have been established over the last number of weeks. What I'd like to do to you for a minute is just outline in broad terms what's happening at the conference. So there'll be three main sessions this morning, and they'll run with a kind of a common thread around using science to tackle the whole emissions reduction piece over the next number of months. In the first session, we'll hear firstly from a colleague of my own, Professor Frank O'Mara from Teagasc. And Frank will outline the science underpinning the initiatives and research taking place in Ireland and indeed across Europe to meet those emissions targets. Secondly, we'll have a recorded piece from Under-Secretary in the USDA, Robert Bonney, on the initiatives and philosophy in terms of science and target reduction in the US. And then we'll have a good pal of mine, Professor John Roche from who's the Chief Science Advisor to the Ministry of Primary Industries in New Zealand, who's come here to talk to you today about the targets and initiatives taking place in his adopted land. After the presentations, Frank and John will join our MC, Damien, to have a panel discussion. And it'll be your opportunity to ask both John and Frank any questions that may arise in the course of the morning. The second session then this morning, we're moving from a kind of a global perspective more towards a within Ireland perspective, and we're looking at it from three different elements. Firstly, from the element of educating the next generation of agricultural scientists. And with this, we've invited Professor Frank Monaghan to talk about ideas and plans from UCD. Secondly, we'll be joined by Dr. Siobhan Kavanagh, who's the Head of Communications for the Signpost Programme in Teagasc, and she'll talk about her work and the work of Teagasc in extending the whole Signpost Programme and getting it adopted at farm level and working with our many industry partners in the initiative. And thirdly, we're joined by John Murray. John is Director of Sectors with Bord Bia, and he'll talk about marketing the whole sustainability piece in Irish agriculture. Our chairperson for that second session is Justin McCarthy from the Irish Farmers Journal. And again, similar to the first session, this will be delivered in the form of a panel discussion, and we'll have plenty of time for you again to ask our three panelists some questions. The third session this morning will focus a bit more on the nitty-gritty of integrating it and getting it adopted both at farmer and at industry level, the whole sustainability piece, I mean. And we've two farmers in our audience, or on our panel here today. The first is John Egerton from County Fermanagh, and John is a dry stock farmer with a huge interest in the whole area of sustainability. And secondly, we have Dr. Siobhan Walsh from the Irish Farmers Journal. Siobhan is the sustainability specialist with the journal, which is also a tillage farmer in her own right and a near neighbour of my own. And she'll do a really good bed and breakfast right beside the National Ploughing Championships in a couple of weeks' time. But we're also joined by industry people. So we're joined by Thomas Ryan from Tirlawn. And Thomas is leading up the whole sustainability piece in Glanbia, working with their dairy farmers to achieve the goals that they've set out. We're joined by Fergal Morris, who's MD of MSD Animal Health in Ireland, and he'll focus in on the technology elements that they're adopting or promoting to increase sustainability at farm level. And thirdly, we're joined by Oliver Kiernan from Hebridean Technologies. I can't remember the name, Oliver, I'm so sorry. Who will talk about the technologies that they're developing for the marine and horse sectors. The ASA is supported heavily by FBD Trust and have initiated a fellowship competition. It was initiated firstly in 2020, and our inaugural winner of that fellowship is Professor Lawrence Chalou. Lawrence is the recently appointed head of Animal and Grassland Research Department in Teagasc. And after our lunch, Lawrence will summarise some of the research that's being conducted by him and his team at Moore Park into gaseous emissions and the technologies that they're investigating to improve this environmental sustainability of our grassland ruminant enterprises. And finally in the afternoon, last but not least, we were fortunate to be joined by Minister Simon Coveney, TD, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Minister for Defence. Simon is very familiar with us all, having been Minister for Agriculture for a 5-year period between 2011 and 2016. So he's a really broad understanding of the importance, values, and challenges facing our industry. And finally, I can't forget to thank our session sponsors, and in particular our conference partner, FBD Insurance, without whom it would not have been possible to organise this conference today. And finally, I'd like to thank you, our audience, for taking the time out of your busy schedules to come here to our conference today. And without further ado, I'm handing you back over to Damien, our MC, for the first session. Thank you very much.
Thanks, George. George, thank you very much. So there you have it. That's an overview of the day ahead. So we're going to begin with our session one. And this is taking a global focus on sustainability and agriculture from 3 different parts of the world, from Ireland and Europe, from the USA, and from a New Zealand perspective. And as George said, that'll be followed up with a short Q&A with our 2 in-house guests, and you will have the opportunity indeed to put some succinct questions, hopefully, if we're on time. So do look out for the roving mics. So our first speaker really needs no introduction to you here. He has over 30 years experience in the whole area of agriculture and ag science. He's an ag scientist, joined Teagasc in 2006, and is just completing his first year as head of Teagasc. Ladies and gentlemen, would you welcome Professor Frank O'Mara.
Thanks, Damien, and good morning, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen. Look, this Ag Science conference has always been a very important conference on the agriculture calendar every year, and it's brilliant to be back here in person for this event in Kilkenny today. And I'm delighted to have been asked to speak at it. So, look, the topic has been well set out, so I'm not going to spend a long time introducing it, but in terms of what does agricultural sustainability mean? Well, look, there are, as we all know, many dimensions to sustainability. We have economics, we have environmental, we have social, and we have innovation, and all are important. But today, I'm very much going to focus on climate change as the challenge of our time. And you know, we've plenty of evidence, most recently from the latest IPCC report, that the window that the world has to avoid fairly catastrophic impacts of climate change is closing rapidly. So that brings us to the sectoral targets piece, and we had a huge amount of debate on this over the summer, so I'm sure you're all very familiar, and I think everybody nearly in the agriculture industry is aware that the target that was set for agriculture, and it's a legally target set in legislation, is to reduce emissions by 25% between 2018 and 2030, which means that emissions have to go down from 23 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent in 2018 down to a figure of 17.25 if we're to reach that target. And the targets there are shown for the other sources of emissions as well. And you'll see that there's one name there, LULUCF, which is left blank. And what is LULUCF? Well, it's very relevant to us in agriculture. It's land use change and forestry. And it's basically the net position when you take account of the sequestration in our soils and forests and also the emissions of CO2 from some of our soils. And as I'll show in a minute, there's huge uncertainty around that. So it's been basically kicked down the road for 18 months, and the government has said they'll come back to that in 18 months and set whatever the target will be for that. And obviously that's going to be very, very relevant to agriculture as well, given that a huge amount of the land of the country is in agriculture. So the first thing I want to do is just take a quick look at some of the targets that are set in other countries for their agriculture sector. And starting first with Northern Ireland, there isn't a specific agriculture target, but the whole territory or the whole economy there has a target to reduce emissions by 48%, so very similar to our overall target of 51%, again by 2030, and again a target to be net zero by 2050. They do have a specific target for methane, and I'll come back to that, and that is that methane should be reduced by at least 46% by 2050. UK, the target is to be net zero by 2050. There isn't a specific ag sector target again, but the UK Climate Change Commission says that agricultural emissions need to fall by 30% by 2035. And the National Farmers Union in the UK has a pledge to aim for net zero by 2040 through a combination of reduced emissions, carbon sequestration, and contributions from renewable energy and the bioeconomy. New Zealand has a target to reduce methane by 10% by 2030 and by 24 to 47% by 2050. But look, I'm sure John will cover that a little bit more detail in his talk. Look, I'm not going to go down through the rest of them, but there was 2 points that I wanted to make about these. And the first is that, these are a selection of countries in the developed world where agriculture is an important sector. And I suppose all those countries you can see are setting fairly ambitious targets for their agriculture sector, just as we have done here in Ireland. And the second point I wanted to make is that some of the countries are setting specific targets for methane, or they're separating out methane as a separate greenhouse gas. And I do want to return to that point later. So look, it's really important that we do have targets. It does focus the mind, and I think it was a step forward that whatever the target was, that the government did at least fix on some targets for the various sources of emissions here in Ireland. But setting a target is really just very much the start of the game. And for years, for decades, the IPCC has been pointing out that there's a big mitigation potential in agriculture. That's mainly related to restoring degraded soils around the world. But it's very clear that that potential has not been realised. And if we look at global emissions from agriculture, they're continuing to grow for the last 2 or 3 decades. So while we can have targets, actually meeting those targets has proven to be difficult so far. And if we look at our emissions here in Ireland, and these are agricultural emissions going back to 1990, and you can see that they've hovered between a figure of maybe about 19 million tonnes up to about 23 million tonnes, so within a relatively narrow band. But you can see the massive change of direction that it's going to take in those emissions to get to that target of minus 25% by 2030. So the challenge is certainly very, very big, and I suppose past performance would not be saying that this is going to be easy. And there's a couple of other points that I would like to make about Irish agricultural emissions and the situation here in Ireland. And the first is that we're already pretty carbon efficient. And I suppose what that means is that we don't have as much low-hanging fruit, maybe, as some other countries might have. Second point I want to make is that, we tend always to look at this from a kind of a regulatory point of view and a legislation point of view and government setting targets and so on. And I think we have to look at it also. We have to be aware that it's bigger than that. Like consumers and society and the customers that buy our food, they do want us to produce low-carbon foods. So there is that market angle that's really, really important as well. I think in the whole debate that took place over the summer about sectoral targets, and it was very divisive at times, and a lot of really unwelcome commentary and so on. But the one thing that I took a little bit of heart from it was that, the role of science did come to the fore, and it wasn't seen that the only pathway for agricultural emissions reduction was to reduce this famous national herd. People were talking about the ability or the possibilities for technology and efficiency to contribute to that emissions reduction, and I'll obviously come back to that in a few minutes. And the last point that I want to make before moving away from this kind of section of the talk is that, we're obviously going to try to go on a very, very difficult journey over the next number of years and decades. And we do have to keep a very close eye on the need to maintain a profitable and competitive industry. If we don't have that at the end of this journey, well, we will have failed somewhere along the way, because we're very much an exporting country, and therefore we need to remain competitive on international markets, and we need a profitable industry if we want people who are interested and willing to participate in that industry. So I suppose a very big challenge maybe is the first main point that I wanted to make. I want to come back to two things that I think are important, and just to lead into those, just to look at the next period, which, we have a big job to do to get to 2030, so, why even look beyond that? But we have a target of climate neutrality by 2050, which seems a long way off, but it is still hugely important. And one of my roles is to sit on the Climate Change Advisory Council, and we're very soon going to start looking at the targets for the period 2025 to 2035. So, we'll be moving on, or the planning will be moving on past 2030 while we're on the journey to 2030. And if we look at the kind of context for what this climate neutrality might mean, or what's the bigger context, and Ireland is obviously, as we all know, part of the EU, and that very much sets the framework for how climate is dealt with here in Ireland. And the EU's climate proposals, they updated them last year into what they call the Fit for 55 proposals. And that sets a very ambitious target that we should have a climate neutral EU land sector by 2035, which is only 13 years away. And by land sector, they mean our agricultural sector, but also this LULUCF that I mentioned earlier, that we still haven't bottomed out what our target is in that. And when you put the two of those together, you get another acronym, which is called AFLU, or Agriculture, Forestry and Land Use. So the EU is saying that whole sector should be climate neutral by 2050, and the pathway to that is that there will be increased carbon removals or sequestration, and that will balance out the emissions, which will reduce over that period of time as well, from including the emissions from livestock and fertilizer use. That's the big plan, and that we'd be climate neutral by 2050 as a whole European Union. Now, that's a plan for the whole EU, not every individual country, because here in Ireland, our AFLU sector is a huge distance from this definition of climate neutrality. But in order for us to know where we stand in that, we do need clarity on two things. We need clarity on methane, and we need clarity on the emissions and removals. And in terms of methane, and I'm not going to go into this in detail, Lawrence may cover this a little bit later on, but basically the science would say, and this is not just Irish science or Teagasc science, this is the IPCC, would say that we need CO2 as the kind of big culprit in climate change to be brought to net zero as quickly as possible. But we don't need methane down at net zero. We need to reduce it. It talks about a strong and sustained reduction. So you can see a different target or a different view taken of those two gases by the IPCC and really, most other scientists that look at this. And going back to my earlier point about the different targets that different countries set, we see that being reflected then in some countries setting out separate targets for methane, as they have in New Zealand. Currently here in Ireland, and in the EU, we don't distinguish them. We just put them all into the one basket and say we've got to reduce that basket of greenhouse gases by 51% by 2030. So, and there are also issues, as I'm sure you're familiar with, the metric that we use or how we account for methane, whether it's this, I won't go into this, but there's different ways, this GWP 100 or GWP star, to measure its impact. So these are all really important issues for us because they very much affect what climate neutrality will look like for us. And because methane is such a big part of our emissions, it's really, really important for Ireland. So we do need clarity on that as soon as possible. The second thing is that our soil emissions, there's huge uncertainty around them. It's very easy to measure the emissions from a car. It's the amount of fuel you burn, and the carbon content of that fuel. It's harder to measure the emissions from an animal. You can't put a meter on the animal, so we try to estimate those using sophisticated models as we can. And we can do that with relative accuracy, but there's still more uncertainty than there is with the car. You come to a field and trying to estimate how much that's emitting or sequestering, there's much more uncertainty in that. And I suppose we do need to bottom out that uncertainty. So to do that, we have set up the National Agricultural Soil Carbon Observatory. And that's a network of 30 of these flux towers situated around the country on both peat-type soils and on mineral soils. And we're also doing deep soil sampling for carbon at selected locations, including on the signpost farms. And the first job of that will be to provide what we call Tier 2, or more accurate picture as to the emissions or removals of carbon from these drained organic soils and from our mineral soils. And that's going to be hugely important in bringing clarity to this LULUCF sector. It'll also very much help prepare us for carbon farming, whatever that will mean. But we do need to know the impact of different management practices on that rate of sequestration in our soils. So that's a big piece of infrastructure that we receive very good funding from the Department of Agriculture to allow us to put in place, and it's going to be very, very important that is bottomed out before we can, I suppose, know how climate neutrality is going to look in Ireland. So moving on, and I've kind of dealt with all the big challenges and how big a challenge this is, and I certainly don't want to minimise that. But I think we can look forward with some hope that technology will give us a pathway out of this. And I suppose the other thing that gives me optimism is what I suppose see as a really strong desire by farmers to actually start addressing this issue. And we had an open day down in Johnstown Castle last week, and we were really pleased with the level of the attendance, but more particularly the engagement of farmers and the interest in them to know, well, what can I do? And when we look at what farmers are actually doing, and I think this is really important, and we have some data now from our signpost farms, not all of them yet, so it's a bit preliminary, but we can see very high levels of use now of some of the technologies that are very important. So protected urea, over a third of the total nitrogen used on those farms is protected urea. Nearly all the slurry is spread by low emissions slurry spreading, and the amount of slurry spread in the springtime is over 50%. And we see similar figures on the beef farms, not quite as high, but certainly very, very high adoption of those technologies as well. Now, they're obviously a selected bunch of farmers, about 120 or so signpost farms. They're, people that are at the forefront. But we also have data just coming through now, and it is preliminary, so my colleagues in the National Farm Survey, did put a small health warning over it. It does need to be checked and so on. But preliminary data from the National Farm Survey Sustainability Report for 2021. And I won't go through this in detail. The point I want to make is that the trajectory of adoption of all the technologies that we are looking at there, so the number of farmers that are using protected urea, the percent of their nitrogen that is protected urea, the amount that are using low emission slurry spreading, the amount of their slurry spread by it, and the number applying lime. You can see that over the last 5 years, very significant trend of increase in all of those. And exactly the same trends, albeit at a lower level, on the cattle farms in the National Farm Survey. So these are representative of all farmers. So I think we see very positive trends emerging now in terms of the adoption rates of those technologies. And when we look at the fertiliser sales figures published recently by the department for October to June not quite the full fertiliser year, but most of it. We see that over in that period, protected urea use increased by 47%, and it's now making up 16% of straight nitrogen sales, not total nitrogen, of straight nitrogen sales. So again, still low, but very encouraging in terms of the trajectory. When we look at what farmers are doing around another really important technology, clover, and again, preliminary results from the National Farm Survey. In the last 3 years, almost 18% of dairy farmers have reseeded with an enhanced clover mix, and a certain proportion of those did that by over-sowing. A smaller proportion on cattle farmers, but again, you can see the trends emerging that farmers are very much adopting these technologies. So moving on, and how are we going to go about achieving this target? And I suppose, I would say that technology and efficiency and science is going to be at the centre of achieving that target. And I'll obviously talk a little bit more about that in the last couple of slides. But it's not just that, it'll need to move beyond just the science and the technology. Incentives will have a huge role to play, and we see the co-ops, some of them bringing in bonus schemes for sustainability, and regulation will also have a role to play. I suppose our role in Teagasc is to create this technology and efficiency roadmap to meet the targets and then to support farmers to implement that roadmap. But we can't do this by ourselves. Teagasc is only one player in the whole Irish agriculture knowledge and innovation system, and other players like the consultants, the co-ops, the likes of Irish Cattle Breeding Federation, and so on, have a huge role to play also in terms of the journey that we're going to go on. In terms of what the technology roadmap looks like, and I'm not going to go into this in too much detail because it will be covered later in the day, but basically we're starting off with emissions of 23 million tonnes in our base year, and we have to get to this target of 17.25 in 2030. And we see that to conceptualise it in kind of three stages. The first is about implementing the measures that we already know, and I suppose that's the purpose of the Signpost programme, is to support farmers with that. But there's a pipeline of new technologies coming as well, and we see those going to contribute significantly towards our journey as well. We are actually in the final stages of producing an updated MAC, or marginal abatement cost curve, and that will give more detail on these new and are almost ready technologies. But what we have, I suppose, that we know we can implement now or in the next few years is not going to be sufficient to bring us the whole way. And we are still going to need to do a lot of research, and there are a number of technologies at an early stage of research that we will be looking at to close the gap to target. And as I said, once we get to 2030, we won't have time to take a breath because we'll be on our journey to try to get to a climate neutral agriculture by 2050. So a very, very challenging target. In terms of what Teagasc is going to do, it's not just business as usual for us. We do see this as a need for us to step up our ambition and our activity. And there's three things that I want to mention to you before I finish that are key parts of our strategy to support the industry here. The first is establishing a new national centre for research and innovation in this space. The second initiative will be to expand out the Signpost programme into a programme that is supporting individual farmers. And the last very significant initiative we have is to build a new digital platform around sustainability. And I want to start at that one first with a slide or two on each of those and explain what it is and why it's important. So the Sustainability Digital Platform, essentially that's a carbon calculator with a decision support tool. And by that I mean it's one thing to go and do a carbon to calculate or baseline the emissions on a farm. But a farmer wants to know, well, if I did this, what impact would it have? Or if I did that, what impact would it have? So that's what your decision support tool is. So we have, I suppose, the models to do the calculation. And the idea is we'll take whole farm data and we'll use data from multiple sources to generate this whole farm picture of emissions. And then using the decision support function, you create a carbon plan for that farm. How will it actually go about reducing the emissions? And then you use you use the data again to monitor the progress that's been made on the farm. And I suppose, as well as sort of supporting farmers in their journey to reduce their emissions. We see this very much has been important to prepare for carbon farming, because we will be looking at the removal side of it as well as the emission side of it in this platform. And that's very important, because carbon farming, whatever that means, and we could have a long discussion around that, it is coming around the corner. And as part of the EU carbon farming proposals, every farm by 2028 needs to have access to verified emissions and removals data. And we would see this platform as being a key part of the infrastructure needed in Ireland to deliver on that for all our farmers. We're working with with ICBF in terms of building this platform. They're a hugely important partner for us in this. And we're also liaising very, very closely with Borbia, because they have been implementing the Carbon Navigator, which is kind of like the forerunner of this for many years now at this stage. So they have huge experience and reach with that. The second initiative is establishing this new National Centre for Climate Research and Innovation. And I suppose, why are we doing this? And well, the first thing is we do feel we need to do more research on this space. It's not as if we've been sitting on our hands for the last number of years. Actually, when we have been on this journey for a while now, and when we look at where we are now, we've actually increased our climate research by about 50% in the last 5 years. Now, that brings us to about a quarter of our research activity is related to climate. So for one topic, it's a very significant focus. And we've done that mainly by reorientating existing staff into climate-related work or prioritising new recruitment. But we need to go further, and I would say we need to get to maybe at least a third of our activity is focused on climate. And to do that part of it, we're going to need additional staff. And that's some of you may have seen, we're currently in the process of recruiting 10 new researchers around climate, and we hope to go significantly further in the next few years. So that's one key purpose, is to increase the amount of research in this space. But secondly, we want to coordinate better our research, firstly across Teagasc, and secondly nationally, and then internationally to link through this centre. And we're not talking about a bricks and mortar thing here, we're talking about a virtual centre across all our platforms. I think for us, it's an important initiative as well to provide visible leadership, because when you look at the structure of Teagasc, you don't actually see any centre or department related to climate change. So it will be a significant step for us to have a very visible entity focused on agri-food climate research. And obviously the primary focus is accelerating the work of bringing new technologies into use. The second, or another key feature of this, and this just speaks to the international part, I'm not going to dwell on these individual bits, but Ireland we're a very small country, and we have a very small research and innovation system here in Ireland, and this is a global issue. So we well recognise that we need to link internationally in relation to this, and we are, I think as a country, we are very strong collaborators internationally, and these are just some of the collaborations some of my own colleagues have been involved in in Europe over the last number of years, and some of the key initiatives that we have been involved in. And I'm just going to look at two of them really. The top left there is a very significant program actually that was run in the EU for the last 6 years or so, called Teagasc. Never mind the acronyms, but basically it involved 32 countries, not just in Europe, involved in 27 projects around mitigating greenhouse gases. And Teagasc was actually the coordinator of that, apart from being involved in many of the individual projects. And following on from that, the EU put in place another big initiative about 3 years ago called EJP Soil, which sort of had a much stronger focus on the soils and the sequestration. It involves 26 countries and 80 million budget over 5 years to be spent on that. And we're part of the leadership team of that. We're involved, or we're leading the Science to Policy work package. So the only point I want to make is that Ireland does need to engage strongly in these initiatives, because as a small player, we do need to be able to learn from them. Sorry, this thing is going live by itself. So, and that's very much part of I suppose, we see our new research centre linking in there. So lastly then, to come to the new Signpost Advisory Programme. Sorry, anyway, you'll probably, sorry, this thing is jumping around a little bit. Bear with me now for a second. I seem to have got stuck in gear. You couldn't go back a slide there, could you? There you are. We'll stop there. So the last piece of initiative or significant initiative we're taking is to expand out the signpost program. And currently that consists of 3 parts. We have the demonstration farms, the network of those. We have the research side on the soil carbon. And in the middle, we have what we call the signpost advisory piece, which is all the knowledge transfer events that we run around the signpost programs and all the materials that we produce and disseminate and so on. But what we don't have as yet in the signpost program is individual follow-up with farmers. So if we get 100 farmers coming to a demonstration farm walk on clover or whatever it might be, when they go home, how many of them will actually take up that technology? We feel we need to have an ability to follow up with those on an individual basis. And that's what the expanded signpost advisory program is going to be about. And I suppose the vision we have for this here is that using the digital platform that I outlined earlier, any farmer that wants to engage in this program will baseline his or her emissions and then sit down with that farmer and develop a plan. It's the farmer's plan, not our plan. Get the farmer to develop a plan as to what he or she will do on their farm over the coming years. We'll support the farmer with the implementation of that, and we'll review progress in 3 years' time as to how you have got on with that plan. So that's, I suppose, we want that ability to deal with individual farmers in relation to the setting of that plan and the implementation of it. And that very much builds on the current advisory network and tools that Teagasc is very lucky to have. We'll also be involving other players in the agricultural knowledge and innovation system, such as consultants and co-ops and so on. And another feature of this is that it's not just available for Teagasc clients. This will be available to any farmer who wants to participate in it. So to conclude, our 2030 targets are certainly very challenging. But that's not a reason to say we can't do it. I think for the post-2030 period, and we can't take our eye off this ball while we're trying to meet the 2030 targets, we do need clarity on methane and soil carbon. I think it's very encouraging to see the take-up of farmers of technologies related to reducing emissions in the last couple of years. And what we have to do is to support them to keep continuing that and to get more farmers involved in that. I think science and the role of technology and efficiency rightly is back centre stage in this. That puts a challenge on all of us as agricultural scientists now to make sure that science can deliver in terms of this journey. And I suppose we don't have all the tools in the toolbox yet. There's more research needed, and there's a huge challenge in terms of adoption. But at least, it is within the power of farmers and the power of us to support them to make very, very significant progress here. This is a top priority for Teagasc for the coming years. And the last point I'd like to make is that no country is going to find this easy. I was at an international conference on Monday about this, and everybody is facing the same challenges to try to reduce the emissions from their sector. So I think that actually creates an opportunity for Ireland, a chance for us to lead and to be one of the first countries to make significant progress in reducing its emissions. And we had a visitor from the FAO at our open day in Johnstown Castle last week, and I asked her at the end, do you think we're mad or we have any chance of reaching these targets? And her response was that, well, look, if you can't do it, nobody can. So I think that's the challenge to us. People are looking to us to see us as a country that does take this seriously, and I think the chance for us to stand up now and really take a strong leadership position in this whole area. So go to Mila Mahagwev.
Thank you, Frank, and Frank will be back with us very shortly. So that's a comprehensive overview from Ireland and from Europe. We're now going to go stateside. And our next speaker, Robert Bonney, is Undersecretary for Farm Production and Conservation at the US Department of Agriculture. He was previously Undersecretary for Natural Resources and the Environment between 2013 and 2017, and he's a former advisor to Secretary Tom Vilsack between 2009 and 2013, both under the Obama administration. He has a very long and detailed background in the whole area of environment and conservation, and he has sent us this message now for the ASA conference from Washington. Robert Bonney.
Hi, my name is Robert Bonney. I'm the Undersecretary for Farm Production and Conservation at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I want to thank the Irish Agricultural Science Association for the invitation to speak today. I'm only sorry that I couldn't be with you there in person. So what I want to do today is I want to talk about the approach that the Biden administration is taking with respect to climate change and agriculture. And then I want to talk about the role of science as we think about the steps we're going to take here in the United States. So first, let me set the stage. In the U.S., agriculture accounts for about 10 to 11% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. Now, our forests, on the other hand, are an enormous net sink of somewhere about the same amount that goes up in agriculture, comes back down as our forests sequester carbon in living ecosystems and wood. Largest sources of our agriculture emissions are methane and nitrous oxide. And as you all know, one of the great things about agriculture is that, yes, there are emissions associated with it, but in both agriculture and forestry, we can sequester carbon. That is, we can go negative in our soils and our ecosystems and our forests. So one of the things I talk about a lot in the U.S. is alignment. And what I mean by that is that a lot of the practices that are good for the climate are also good for productivity and agricultural soils. I've worked on environmental issues for a long time. When I started my career in conservation, I worked on endangered species. And endangered species, you often see conflict between landowners and environmental objectives because there are costs associated with endangered species conservation. And in the U.S., we regulate endangered species on private lands. And as a result, you run into conflicts between conservation, agriculture, and forestry. And the interesting thing about climate policy as we think about agriculture and forestry is that there's not that conflict, there's far more alignment. So on the mitigation side, as we think about what are the practices we can do to store carbon in the soil, to improve soil health, or to manage nutrients and nitrogen better, or to capture methane, or to employ precision agriculture practices, or in the case of forestry, to manage our forests in a way that make them healthier, all those things are not only good for the climate, they're also good for agriculture and forestry. And so there's this alignment that you see in climate and agriculture that's, I think, really, really important. There's also alignment on resilience. When you think about the practices that are good for the climate, soil health, nutrient management, many of those things actually make our agricultural systems more resilient in the face of extreme weather events, drought, flooding, and other things that we're increasingly seeing here in the U.S. And so as we think about policy in the U.S., we want to take advantage of that alignment between what's good for the climate, what's climate smart, and what's good from a production standpoint as well. And let me actually touch on productivity, because I think it often gets lost in conversations around agriculture and climate change. Productivity matters as a climate strategy. Look at the war in Ukraine right now, horrible situation, but it's put a finer point for all of us on the importance of maintaining global food supplies. And so as we think about climate policy into the future, yes, obviously reducing greenhouse gases is critically important, but also we have to maintain global food supplies. And so we can't lose the importance of productivity in and of itself as a climate strategy. There's a lot of interest, obviously, in tropical deforestation and the pressure on ecosystems across the globe, and a lot of that is a result of interest in expanding lands for agriculture. If we want to address issues like pressure on ecosystems, deforestation, we have to maintain agricultural productivity. And that means agriculture has to get more efficient. We have to be able to grow food while maintaining or reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Now, when I talk to U.S. farmers and ranchers and forest owners about that, I note that the U.S. is actually really good at efficiency, technology, innovation, precision agriculture, where we're using GPS technology to put the right amount of nitrogen or the right amount of inputs on a certain acre. That type of efficiency can be used in a way that can really benefit the climate. And so again, as we think about productivity, the thing that alignment is there for U.S. agriculture. The other thing is we think about U.S. policy or the limits of a purely regulatory approach. Again, I think back to my days of conserving endangered species habitat on private lands. Often what we need when we think about ecosystems in the United States is we actually need our landowners, our farmers, our ranchers, our forest owners to actually take on actions that they wouldn't otherwise do. They need to restore habitat, or maybe they need to utilize prescribed fire or other practices, voluntary practices to protect habitat. And so regulations often don't do a good job in this country of actually getting people to voluntarily adopt new practices. And when we think about climate, that's what we need. We actually need producers to be willing to step forward and to adopt these new types of practices. And so when we think about what the approach the U.S. will take on policy, it's one that's going to be heavily focused on voluntary incentives, on producer-led efforts, on collaboration. We're going to employ partnerships across universities and farmers and local conservation groups and local farm groups. It's going to be one that relies on innovation and technology. We're going to need new innovations, seed technology, nitrogen technology, and others to maintain productivity even while we reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The bottom line is that what we do for the climate has to work for agriculture. If our farmers and ranchers and forest owners can't implement it, integrate it into their existing operations, we're much less likely to see to see climate benefits. And as we think about this approach, science becomes very important because we need science to be able to measure the impacts of all it is we're doing. And so our investments in science are going to be really, really important. But let me come back to that. First, I want to talk about the things that the Biden administration is doing related to climate policy. USDA has a number of voluntary conservation programs, the Conservation Reserve Program, the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, where we work with farmers and ranchers and forest owners to share the costs of implementing a variety of conservation practices. We're using those programs now to focus on climate-smart practices. The Conservation Reserve Program to take marginal lands out of production to restore plants and trees in ways that will sequester carbon. Or we're using the Environmental Quality Incentive Program to promote soil health, cover crops, and other approaches. The Inflation Reduction Act, which was just passed by Congress, has $14 billion in the coming years for us to focus on climate-smart practices through those voluntary conservation programs. So we'll be staffing up, we'll be spending more money in partnership with farmers and ranchers and forest owners to put those practices in place. We're also using our existing programs. For example, we have a crop insurance program here at USDA. We provided, this year and the previous year, we provided a rebate of $5 per acre for producers that adopted cover crops, that utilize cover crops. So we're thinking about, are there ways that we can integrate incentives into crop insurance and other programs? We're also looking at ways that we can invest in resilience, soil health, and other practices in our forests, improve forest management, to reduce the impacts of drought, flooding, and other things. So we'll continue to make important investments there. And our traditional programs like crop insurance and other programs that provide a safety net for farmers and ranchers are increasingly important as we see these impacts from climate change. We're also investing in things like improved irrigation systems, improved water use efficiency, places like the West where we have significant drought. How can we stretch our water resources and maintain agricultural productivity? One of the new efforts we're really excited about is something we call the Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities. This is an effort to take $1 billion from a program called the Commodity Credit Corporation and to incentivize farmers, ranchers, and forest owners working together to deploy climate smart practices across broad acreages. We want to subsidize the implementation of those practices, and then we want to also pay for the measurement, monitoring, and verification that goes along with that. And so if farmers want to produce a carbon credit, or maybe they want to produce climate smart soybeans, or climate smart cotton, or climate smart wood, that's up to them. We want to support a market-based approach by helping to underwrite the costs of practice deployment, as well as the measuring and monitoring that goes along with that. We've received over 1,000 proposals in the program, up to $20 billion in requests. In the coming weeks, we'll be announcing the successful proposals. We're excited about it. Agriculture and forestry has stepped forward in a big way, and we think there'll be important results and important learning that comes from that program. As I noted before, investments in science are going to be really, really important as we do all this. As we think about our partnerships program, how do we make sure that our investments in climate smart practices are actually resulting in real climate benefits? But our investments in science are going to be important as we think about the technologies and innovations that we need to partner with the private sector and with agriculture on. So we'll continue to make investments there. In resilience and mitigation, what are the practices, what are the technologies that can allow us to have a more resilient agriculture even while we mitigate greenhouse gases? And a really important area is going to be around inventory and monitoring. How do we do a better job of our inventory in the US, our forests, soil carbon, methane, nitrous oxide? And how do we better understand what our landowners are doing, what our farmers are doing, and understand sort of the trends related to the adoption of climate smart practices? Obviously, science is critically internationally as well. We're really excited about the AIM4C efforts internationally and the partnerships there to share information and to make investments in innovation and technology. As we think about the future of agriculture and climate policy, you know, it's hard to know whether we're headed to a future that might have a significant reliance on carbon markets, or maybe it'll be done through consumer demand for climate smart products, or it's hard to know exactly where we'll be a decade or 15 years from now. But what we do know is that agriculture and forestry can and must play a really, really important role. And in order for us to be successful, we have to both maintain productivity, rely on new innovation, and importantly, we have to have the science to help us do that, to help us guide our work. And so science is going to play a really important role, not just on the innovation side, but on the monitoring, the measurement side, and in allowing us to develop more resilient agricultural systems, even as we reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So thanks again. Great to be with you virtually today, and sorry I couldn't be there in person. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much to Robert Bonney. So our third speaker in this session is originally from a farm in County Kerry, but in 2018 he was appointed as the Chief Science Advisor to New Zealand's Ministry for Primary Industries, and only last month he also took on the additional role as Director for On-Farm Support with the Ministry to work with farmers in relation to information, opportunities and advice around the whole area of sustainability. His name is Professor John Roche, and I'm delighted to say John is here with us to give us a New Zealand perspective. John.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Thanks, George, for the invitation. And yeah, thank you all for turning up. I've got a few slides. I don't want to eat into the panel time because I'm really keen to see what kind of questions come from the floor. So hopefully I'll scoot through these over the next 10 minutes. From a New Zealand perspective, very, very similar to what Frank has outlined earlier. Like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the one thing everybody needs is to eat. Eat healthy foods. It is right at the base of the pyramid. As the old saying goes, once in your life, you need a doctor, a priest, a policeman, and a lawyer. But every day, 3 times a day, you need a farmer. Really, really important that we keep that in mind. Because the world is facing a massive challenge. And it's not just climate change. This is the amount of food that the world has had to produce over the last 2,000 years since the time of Christ. And to put it in perspective, we have to produce as much food we have to produce as much protein in the next 30 years as we have in the last 2,000 years. Let me say that again. We have to produce as much protein, as much micronutrients in the next 30 years as we did in the last 2,000 years. That is an extraordinary challenge. We're already failing. For the first time in almost 50 years, we're starting to see world hunger grow again. And this predates COVID. So this wasn't just a COVID effect. And of course, that's being exacerbated by the current situation in Eastern Europe and Russia. And yet, there's been an awakening, an increased awareness of the importance of environmental sustainability in everything we do as well, to our own health and well-being, but also to future generations' health and well-being. And so, for the first time in human history, there is no land. There is no more land. Up until the Green Revolution, we increased our food production, yes, through better agronomic techniques, and yes, through better breeding, but there was always more land. And in fact, we're probably using too much land. We have to retire some of it. And water is fast becoming a scarce resource. In countries, as I know the sunny southeast put on a beautiful morning for me this morning, as I left the sunny southwest, in countries where we have a lot of water, we tend to underestimate the value of water. So this is a scale diagram from one of the US government agencies. So you've got the size of the world. The big bubble is the size of all the water in the world. That is the full extent of the water. Everything that's in the oceans, everything that's in our rivers, everything that's in the groundwater, everything that's in our bodies, everything that's in the atmosphere. That's all of the water in the world. So those of you at the back of the room might not be able to see the little bubble that's actually sitting beside that. That is all of the fresh water in the world. 1% of the water in the world is fresh water. And most of that is not available to us because it's groundwater, it's deep groundwater. And I'm certain at the back of the room you won't be able to see the real small little bubble at the top of Florida. That is the fresh water that is available to us in the world. That puts water in perspective and our need to preserve it. And rainfall patterns are changing. So this is New Zealand data. Over the last 25 years, our rainfall has dropped by 11% over that period on average. In some regions, it's much worse. It's over 25% in Northland, for example, the area north of Auckland. And for a number of summers, we have been trucking water into townships in Northland as their wells run dry. So we are seeing a massive shift in our rainfall patterns at the same time as we're seeing the world warm up and our evapotranspiration rates grow. So we're sucking more water out of the country, and the rainfall is not coming down to actually replenish it. And of course, we're seeing rainfall patterns change. This is the top of the South Island 2 weeks ago. So Wayne Langford is a farmer in Golden Bay where we get 1,800 millimeters of rain a year. Between Tuesday and Saturday morning 2 weeks ago, he recorded 904 millimeters of rain. 3 feet of rain. It's of biblical proportions, and it's no longer unique. We are seeing it repeatedly in New Zealand. Whether that's our positioning latitudinally to the tropics or not, we don't know, but certainly I think the vast majority of people in these situations are no longer denying climate change. And of course, we're sitting in a situation of disinformation, misinformation, malinformation, and at the back of that, we've got a disengaged farming community that are tired of being the whipping boy for everything that is wrong in the world. It's a really terrible situation when you think that the world depends on us. Remember what I said? Every day, 3 times a day, you need a farmer. Now, I was trained as a nutritionist. I know you wouldn't think it to look at me, but anyway, I was. And the best piece of nutrition advice I was ever given was stick to the outside aisle of the supermarket. Stay away from the inside aisles. And when you think about it, and I can think to my supermarket in Hamilton in New Zealand or to Garvey's below in Castle Island, you walk into the supermarket, fresh fruit and veggies, you walk past the red meat section, around the corner into the ice creams, and around the corner into the dairy, the cheese, the preserved meats, and down into the alcohol corner at the end, you know. You've got a perfectly balanced diet if you stick to the outside aisle of the supermarket. We, New Zealand and Ireland, produce the outside aisle of the supermarket. It's a huge badge of honor that we should wear with pride. And to see farmers disconnected, lacking in hope, is really, really off-putting. And I think that's one of the jobs that we need to do, and I applaud Frank and what he's just outlined there. We need to bring back hope back up the farm driveway. We can do this. The other thing that we should be proud of is we have made massive productivity improvements, or productivity improvements as the last speaker pronounced it. This again is our New Zealand data. You can see that our feed conversion efficiency on the left-hand side has improved dramatically. We require approximately 30% less feed per kilo of milk solids than we did 40 years ago. And we're producing, our greenhouse gas footprint per litre of milk has dropped by 40% over that same period. However, our dairy industry has doubled over the same period. And so we've increased our greenhouse gas footprint by about 120%. And when we look at our water quality statistics, they don't make good reading either. And so there are problems that we need to address. We can't just say the world depends on us, leave us alone. The world does depend on us, but the world also depends on us to lead. So on the back of that, coming out of the lockdowns in 2020, our Prime Minister launched Fit for a Better World. So this is our national strategy, our post-COVID economic recovery. And we've got 3 pillars to Fit for a Better World. I'm going to start at the bottom, inclusiveness. Probably similarly in Ireland, although I don't think it's as bad, the disconnect between non-farming and farming is just extraordinary. We're dependent, and we learnt this through COVID as our borders closed, hugely dependent on migrant labour that doesn't come from New Zealand, is not invested in New Zealand food production. So one of our goals is to employ 10% more New Zealanders into the primary sector, reconnect the non-farming community to the farming community. Sustainability, I'm going to touch on this, I'll go into it in greater detail, so I won't go into it now. And productivity, of course, we've got to pay the bills. You can't be green if you're not in the black. And so we intend to add an extra $44 billion to the national economy through the primary sector on top of what would already have happened over the next decade. So they're the 3 pillars of Fit for a Better World. Our key sustainability initiatives, obviously greenhouse gases is what we're here to talk about. And as Frank outlined, we adopted a split gas approach. We listened to the science. Biogenic methane is very different to fossil methane, and it's very different to carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide. We got tired of arguing, should it be GWP 100, should it be GWP 20, should it be GWP star? By separating out the gas, by separating methane out on its own and giving it its own target, it doesn't matter. The index doesn't matter anymore. We will reduce methane by somewhere between 24 and 47% by 2050, by 10% by 2030, and nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide to net zero. That's key. Nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide can be offset by sequestration. Methane can't. That's a gross target. It will have to be reduced. Fresh water. Again, we've got targets there to stop further degradation in waterways that are degraded and make material improvements within 5 years, returning them to a healthy state within a generation. And we've, like yourselves, we've got policy documents around the conservation of biodiversity. From a research perspective, we developed 8 R&D accelerators out of Fit for a Better World. So remember, our primary sector, Ministry for Primary Industries includes fisheries, aquaculture, forestry, food safety, biosecurity, and agriculture. So it's an interesting ministry to belong to from a chief science advisor perspective. Key for discussion here is obviously our biological emissions reduction accelerator. The government committed in the budget in June an additional $339 million over a 4-year period to knock methane and nitrous oxide on the head. So up till now, we've argued there hasn't been the money to do the research. That's no longer an excuse. And so some of the initiatives that Frank was talking about earlier, we really have a new opportunity now. Just like Teagasc, we're starting a new Centre for Climate Action and Agricultural Emissions. That will be, within that, there will also be a joint venture between industry and government, where we're hoping somewhere between $50 and $100 million a year will be committed by both parties to actually drive that R&D agenda, to pull it forward by industry and to drive it forward with research. That's been developed in partnership with Maori industry and science. Again, as Frank alluded to, there are solutions and there are more to come. We can do this. I have no doubt that we can do this. I'm happy to talk about some of these in question time. From a policy perspective, we have an industry government agreement called He Waka Eke Noa, Waka is a canoe in Maori, he waka e kanoa, we are all in this together. And it's really, really important that we're all pulling the paddles at the same speed at the same time, so we don't have a waka going around in circles. So this was an industry-government partnership to identify how can we price agricultural emissions rather than putting it into the emissions trading scheme, which would add complexities and make it really difficult for agriculture. That will land sometime later this year. I'm not going to touch on fresh water, actually, because I'm more keen to hear your questions. But just finally, regenerative agriculture. I've never come across a term, I think, that creates so much angst among farmers in New Zealand. Because, and look, as a scientist, I do understand this, the regenerative movement was very much a postmodern movement 20, 30 years ago in a lot of cases. Not always, but in a lot of cases. And so we have taken the concept of regenerative agriculture, which is beyond sustainability. It's by doing the right thing and philosophically going out every day to do the right thing, and created a vision for regenerating Aotearoa, Aotearoa being the Maori word for New Zealand. And that vision is that practices that in isolation or collectively can achieve improved outcomes for our productive landscapes, rivers, coastal and marine environments, biodiversity and natural ecosystems, improve animal welfare, and have potential to increase profitability and add value, promote health and well-being for humans, whilst ensuring we can grow and consume our food and fiber products sustainably, and meet goals of Taiao, the world, the ecosystem, Whenua Ora, a healthy land, Maori Ora, a healthy spirit, and Te Aotearoa, a general wellness. Anything that can do that is a regenerative practice, and farmers should be encouraged and recognized for adopting regenerative practices that lead to these outcomes. And so finally, again, I won't go into great detail, but in MPI, we have a research fund called Sustainable Food and Fiber Futures, SFF Futures. We now have a regenerative ag portfolio that is commissioning work all throughout the country, looking at different grazing species, so diverse pasture mixtures, different grazing practices, and other on-farm practices that may lead to an improvement in those environmental outcomes that we talked about. Happy to talk about any of them in detail. But Gilbert Anoka is the All Blacks high-performance psychology coach. And there's a degree of irony about an Irishman quoting an All Blacks coach after the recent test down there, which I must admit made life very, very sweet for a while. But Gilbert Anoka is a very famous psychology coach. And he says that elite athletes preserve the core and they disrupt the edges. And that is really important because that is what we have to do. As Frank said, we produce highly efficiently sustainable food. But the world now needs us to lead again. And so we need to disrupt the edges to actually bring us back to a better place from an environmental sustainability perspective. And I'm going to leave it at that, and happy to take any questions, Damien.
John, thank you very much for that. Very interesting. I'd say it was sweet for a few weeks there, was it?
The best thing was not to say anything about it. They hate you even more.
But they gave us a lot of credit for what we did, though, didn't they?
They did, but they criticized their coaching team probably every bit as much as they gave us credit. But it was, look, unfortunately, I saw the first match in Eden Park, which was not the match to attend. The other two I watched on TV.
And as a Kerry man, you're having a great year.
Absolutely.
Lap it up, suck it up while you can. Yeah. Frank, can I come back to you and your presentation a little bit earlier on? When I was at the Open Day last week, amazing technology, more to come, as you said, as part of the signpost. But the question a lot of people put is, we knew about the challenges a way back. Are we late to the game? Are we too late to the game?
Look, I wouldn't say we're too late, you know what I mean? I think every journey, it's always, the hardest part is to get on the road. If you're doing a job yourself, painting the house or fencing the field or whatever, the hardest bit is to go out and actually drive the first stake. So, look, I think what's really important for us now is not to kind of look back with any regrets or anything like that, to say, look, we have a challenge ahead, we have an opportunity ahead, let's go out and try and meet that challenge. I think, you know, we're in a reasonably good state here in Ireland in comparison to other countries. You know, we have a good range of technologies that we know we can adopt. We have a kind of a good research system here generating new ones. I think one thing that we really have here that's a strength to us is a kind of a well-connected industry. So, you know, Teagasc, we're just one player in it. You know, we work very closely with industry, the co-ops, the meat factories. We work very closely with farmers and other agencies and players in it. And that's a big strength to us, you know, because it's really important not to do research in isolation. And our advisory service is a great kind of a grounding of connecting the research to the farmers. But also that connection that we have to farmers really, I think, is important to make sure that the research we do is relevant in that. So I'm positive.
Well, and it's good to hear that, because after the tug of war over the targets, there's very little wriggle room left, no excuse sort of land by the time we reach 2030. But you can only be as strong as your weakest link. And I spoke with Tom O'Dwyer of the Signpost programme last week in Johnstown, and he said that he was hearing reports from some of the Signpost farmers who were saying that, you know, there are other farmers out there that are not interested, that are not pulling their weight. And, you know, if every farmer in the country is to adopt technologies like you spoke about earlier on, multi-species swords and so on, some reports suggest that we're only going to reach 18%. That's if everybody pulls together. So are you worried that, you know, there are going to be some chinks in the armour there when it comes to some farmers just not being interested or not being able to adopt the technologies required?
Yeah, and look, obviously, you know, the change or the type of transformation we're talking about, it doesn't happen overnight. You know, you have early adopters, you have followers, you have people that are kind of hard to reach and very slow to adopt technology. And that's where I think, you know, it's going to be really important, the kind of emergence that we've seen of bonus schemes for sustainability by the co-ops. And I think we're going to see those grow that you know, will encourage everybody. And none of us, farmers included, like to leave anything behind on the table. So, you know, I think they are going to be very important in terms of encouraging farmers to adopt technologies. But the figures we're seeing now coming through from the National Farm Survey, which are representative, you know, they're anonymised farmers, so these are not a selected bunch. Like, it's very heartening to see the kind of year-on-year growth. It's still at low levels, but it's a very, very encouraging trend in terms of adoption.
John, separating the methane, how did that go down politically in New Zealand?
How did it go down politically?
Yes, in other words, I mean, was there...
Yeah, Damien, I think it was just accepted. I mean, we had followed, obviously, the research that has been undertaken, led by the Oxford team, but with New Zealand researchers involved. So we had been having this conversation about biogenic methane, the cycle of methane, carbon dioxide being taken up by the grass, being eaten by the cow, being converted to methane, etc. But recognizing, obviously, that methane has a really strong forcing potential when it's in the atmosphere, but a short half-life. So we've been having those discussions for probably the better part of a decade anyway. So to land in that place, I think, was very sensible advice from the Climate Change Commission.
And what about, you know, the environmental lobby? How did they react to it?
They're probably not as convinced as those of us that work in the primary sector. You know, some of those people are idealistic and they want to see change and rapid change quickly. So to not every ton of methane warms. Let's be honest here. But every ton of methane is replacing a ton of. If methane in the atmosphere is staying at the same concentration, then every new ton is replacing an old ton that's being degraded. So, but if you were to take out that ton, you wouldn't have that warming impact, so you would see a cooling trend. So there is that argument that if you reduce methane by more than you need to just keep atmospheric warming the same, you will actually give some headroom for carbon dioxide. The scientists that have done most of the work on GWP star would argue you don't want to do that because carbon dioxide is the real problem here. And by giving headroom, you're just you're kicking the can down the road and you're increasing the warming in the long term. So I think that you've probably got a mixed reaction there. There's an acceptance that methane is different to the other two gases.
Will you talk to me about this methane vaccine, which I've been reading about? Where are we with that?
Well, we're still in the prototype stage, but the great thing was, 3 years ago, we had no COVID vaccine. And I remember through the first 6 months of COVID, thinking to myself, this is a tall ask. I can't see a vaccine being delivered. And yet we delivered a vaccine within a year, with collaboration, with the immediacy of need, and with the money to do it. And I think the investment that's coming now, the lessons that have been learned probably in the development of failed COVID vaccines will be hugely beneficial to us in developing a vaccine. So where are we at? Well, for the last 10 to 15 years, there's been work going on in this space. I know, Frank has sat on the science advisory group of a team that's led the charge in this. The lab work shows that the antibodies can reduce methane in the lab. The animal work shows that we can get the animal to produce the antibodies in his or her saliva. The next stage of the work is, can we get it to work in the rumen, in vivo? And that's a high risk, but potentially very high reward piece of research that needs to be undertaken.
Frank, is that a silver bullet, or would it affect our white meat status if we started vaccinating?
No.
Would it be other complications it would create?
I wouldn't think so, actually. I think it would be, a kind of a very well accepted thing. Vaccines by and large are very well accepted by people as safe and effective therapies, mainly for preventing disease. In this case, reducing methane emissions. So look, I think that's an incredibly important piece of work. I was privileged to kind of sit on that advisory board for a number of years and see the huge effort that's gone into to try to do that. And I think, look, Ireland has a huge amount in common with New Zealand in terms of our agricultural system, and there are great sort of connections in research and in extension and so on. And it was very good to see our department and John's department, the MPI in New Zealand, signing an agreement to increase that collaboration. So look, we'd be hoping that we can grow our collaboration, John, with New Zealand scientists, and I think it's to benefit of both of us, and that's certainly one very promising line. It's this, we don't have technologies, as you said, to go the full journey to 25% yet. We are going to need research to develop additional ones, and that's one very promising line.
Okay, I know you may have questions from the floor, far more sensible ones than I'm asking, so please, there are people going around with roving mics, just make yourself known. But just one more question, Frank. So we have this target now, we have the technology, the farmers are willing to embrace it, but where do they begin? Where's the baseline? And I had Dr. John Gilliland, or Professor John Gilliland, on my show a few weeks ago, where he was talking about, the approach in Northern Ireland and almost the field-by-field approach. So farmers are saying, yeah, I want to play my part here. I want an easy life. I want to be able to make money, but play my part. But how do I begin? How do I measure? There's no sort of leadership or roadmap there, am I right? Or do farmers actually know where to start and how to measure progress?
I think it's a really good point, and I'd say, I think the appetite is there certainly among a cohort of farmers. They're looking to the future and they want to have a business that's resilient. They don't want their neighbours looking at them saying, God, you're doing fierce damage and all that. So they want to get their business into a position that they're proud of it and that it can stand up to whatever scrutiny. So look, one of the big programs we launched last year was the Signpost program, and I think that has been it has had a great first year in terms of getting itself established and getting itself known. And what I outlined in the talk, we want to take that on to the next step now, where we actually get down to an individual farmer. And it's one thing getting a group of farmers coming to events or distributing material to them, but you need to sit down at their table or go to their field and say, well, look, this is what you can do. So that's the plan we have, is to put in place this dedicated advisory program to work with farmers, to give them that baseline and to work out with him or her. This is the couple of, maybe the 4 or 5 most important things to do over the next couple of years, and to support them with that. Something like clover might need a good bit of support. Something like protected urea is a fairly easy decision, but whatever support is needed, give farmers that, and look and monitor and review and see, yeah, God, actually you said you were going to do these 5 things, you have them done. We thought at the start that would reduce your emissions by, pick a figure, 20%, and look, it has. Isn't that brilliant? So that's the kind of, I think, next step that we want.
So the tools are there to measure and inform farmers.
They are. Well, yes, they're there, I suppose, at a research level. That's the tool we're building with ICBF, to kind of give us that picture when we go onto a farm, that we can work with a farmer and get a little bit of more information with the farm, but we'd have an awful lot of it from the databases that exist in this country, and say, that's your starting position. Okay. And these are the couple of things now, this is the impact of each of this menu of options.
And I know, John, you keep an eye on what's going on here. You were milking cows with your brother in Kerry during the week as well. So you know where we are in terms of the targets in this country. You know, obviously, that we've had an increase in cow numbers due to the abolition of quotas, a problem that they didn't have in New Zealand over the last 30 or 40 years, or an issue that they didn't have there. So Are there any lessons from what's going on in New Zealand that maybe could be applied here that, we...
Absolutely. Look, I think Frank summed it up brilliantly. We've got very similar systems, and we've got exactly the same challenges and opportunities. So I think there's lessons going both ways. So I'm meeting with some of Frank's team tomorrow and next week to learn more about the Signpost Farm. So in my new role as the Establishment Director of On-Farm Support Services, it is about demystifying and explaining regulations in clear language so that farmers understand what they need to do to actually achieve their obligations. And like you said, the majority of them actually do want to achieve those obligations, but it's not clear. So one of the first points is to know their number, to understand what is their number and what is contributing to that number and what can you do about it. So I think the Signpost Farms is a step ahead of us, and we'd like to catch up really, really quickly. I'm also the chair of the Science Advisory Committee for Vista Milk, and so we had a meeting yesterday morning and last night, and it was incredible to see the really great research that's being undertaken. And more importantly, one of our limits now is not going to be money, it's going to be people. And so to Frank's point, I think us putting our people together will be really, really important to us achieving what needs to be achieved. But I saw a whole swag of really young, enthusiastic, and bright postgraduate students and postdoctoral candidates online last night, and that gave me great hope that we have that capacity coming through as well. So I think there's lessons going both ways, and I'm really, really keen to explore how we can do it further.
Okay, it's good to hear about the collaboration. Okay, so if we have any questions from the floor, and just without sounding rude about it, just if you have a specific question, introduce yourself and who you'd like to ask. Prefer that than any statements, because we are a little bit behind time. So, have we anybody? I can't believe everybody here is so shy. Maybe everybody is satisfied that they know everything. It's the one down here. Yeah, it's just difficult to see. Yeah, go ahead.
The absence of a banquet the night before, now you say, a different...
Hi, Anne Finnegan from the Irish Farmers Journal. Thanks to Frank and John for superb presentations. I suppose, Frank, to you first, and I appreciate you sit on the Climate Change Advisory Council, but the chair of the Climate Change Advisory Council statement following the setting of the emission ceilings, I thought was quite telling, in that she pointed to the fact that the emission ceilings don't actually align to the carbon budgets. So my question is, are we open to legal challenge on that? And we've seen some letters from academics who've been very active in this space in recent times. And if so, what are the implications of that on the sector? I mean, could we actually see that 25% target being much more difficult to attain if it fell into defined carbon budgets? And I suppose the second question to both is just generally, is there a risk that in agriculture in Ireland, and not necessarily in Ireland, but more globally, that we don't make as much progress as rapidly as required, and that starts to undermine the confidence of, that flow of funds that's necessary into the sector? And particularly I'm thinking about the investment community who fund global agri-food, who are putting huge pressure on animal protein at the moment to change rapidly, and are also looking at alternative proteins and the higher margins that are available there, and also the likes of what we've seen with Rabobank in the Netherlands and the moves they've made in the past couple of weeks. Thank you.
All right, and thank you very much for that. So I suppose, just Anne's questions there about the pressure to deliver and to see progress and to see it happening very quickly.
Look, absolutely there is, but I'd put it kind of almost the other way around. If we can show early progress, I think the change in the narrative that would bring about would be huge.
How do you define that now?
By, we'll say that for the next couple of years, we're able to see our emissions reducing. Like agricultural emissions in 2021 were higher than 2020. So that's a bad news story. It keeps pressure onto the system. So if the next year, if that figure was flipped around, and if we continued to make progress for a few years, people would start saying, oh God, yeah, them guys in agriculture and girls.
But is there a minimum bar? I mean, going down 1% to 2% is not going to make much of a difference. Do you have a roadmap in that regard as to monitor progress and demonstrate it?
Yeah. Well, sure, look, we have a 25% reduction target, and it's compound interest, I suppose.
Yeah.
But even if you were to divide that by 8 years, you want to be dropping by 3 or 4% a year. So we need to see, I suppose, significant progress being made. But if we can get some early progress, it would change the narrative, I think.
And it's in water quality. I mean, the EPA reports, they're the big ones, really, that kind of point the finger at dairy, at dairy expansion, in the broad spectrum. Excuse me. Isn't that very important to actually reverse?
Oh, absolutely. Look, we're focusing here on climate change, and, there's a suite of other environmental issues, chief among them probably being water, that we have to address, and we could have a whole other conversation around that. But look, there's a lot going on in that space as well, and the new nitrous derogation has put in some tightening in terms of what we can do in terms of things like banding and so on. And we have the ASA program in terms of advising farmers how to improve water quality. So yes, we do have to and improve our water quality.
Do we have to accept that derogations are going to go in the near future?
Look, I very much hope not. I think, but in order for us to keep our derogation, well, number one, we're going to have to show that we're able to improve our water quality within our derogation limits. And there are only a couple of countries in Europe left that apply for a derogation anymore. We're one of them because the system we have, it does lend itself, we'll say, to carrying on good land. It lends itself to carrying an appropriate stocking rate that is beyond the 170 kilos. So for us, it's a very important component of our production system, and I think we have to reach our water targets in order to
earn it
like that. Yeah.
At this point. Okay, we have another question. Yep, down here. It's just there's light in us here, so apologies if we don't actually see immediately. I think here at this table.
When I have the mic, I'll take it. Damien, Mike McGann.
Yeah,
it's very clear that there's good hard science. It's the soft science is the piece that's missing, the behavioural change stuff. How do we accelerate the behavioural change? And maybe as a suggestion, ownership of the problem is a great way of getting a solution. And if we own the carbon as farmers, if we measure and own what we have something to at least set ourselves against in reduction terms. So I suggest that maybe we have to have a look at who owns the emission, who owns the carbon. We will own the emissions, obviously, but we need to own the solution as well. So I think there's something that we need to do around that. Accelerating the change, the social science, the behavioural change is where I think we need to concentrate. I'm delighted to hear the collaboration between both of you. I think that needs to be more formalised and more structured and more visible. And I think because the compatibility is enormous, and if we can sort of show globally we're in a good place, what we're doing from pasture-based production systems, we will ultimately benefit, but we need to accelerate that.
Okay, I'll take that as a comment, Mike, as such. There's another man over here with a question, but just on that, can I about messaging, and building that bridge from farmers to the general public, which you talked about. There is actually an initiative going on in New Zealand because it is a very divisive situation that we have here in this country.
Yeah, look, and Mike, I think you're absolutely right. We forget the soft sciences at our peril. So what I didn't point, one of those accelerators at Fit for a Better World is actually is the social science of change, recognizing that. Both of our countries' agricultural industries were built on farmers and scientists walking hand in hand. With farmers coming up with an awful lot of the solutions, scientists quantifying them, breaking it down and explaining how it worked, and then being able to transfer it out. So I think that's one of the key things, Mike, and you've summed it up well, is owning the problem and thinking about the solution and working really closely together. It's one of the things that excites the heck out of me in my new role. Sorry, I'm talking to myself over my shoulder here as well. It's really off-putting with this mic. The director of on-farm support services is the idea of getting back out with farmers, getting them to understand where their footprint is coming from, getting them to come up with solutions, working with them to form those solutions, and then utilizing those solutions to get their peers to change. Farmers learn from farmers. So, I think you're right.
Hey, man here, yep.
Hello, John Horgan from Keepack Group. So I'd just like to compliment, all three speakers, one virtual and two present, on their presentations and the confidence that they displayed in science's capacity, if you like, to deliver on the challenges that we're faced. I'm just wondering, are we all, and the American speaker used the word alignment, which was an important concept too. And I'm just wondering, are we all aligned in Ireland on the objectives? Because if we read the agri-media in the current week, we see schemes being mooted to actually take out production, when science is telling us that if we all pull together and achieve high adoption rates of technologies that are available or coming down the track, that we can retain the current capacity to produce in this country and maybe deliver some of the millions of tons of protein that John referred to that we need to deliver in the next over the next period of time to feed a growing population.
Thanks, John. Frank, collective buy-in.
I think it's a really good point, John. And I suppose, look, the way I look at it, if you looked at the debate a year ago or 6 months ago, for a lot of people from the outside of agriculture, the only solution they could see to agriculture was to cut this famous national herd, and all the questions about how much is it going to be cut by, and so on and so forth. At least now technology is on the table, and okay, while some people might feel that technology isn't enough, I remember hearing one very senior journalist, talking about sort of tricking around with technology won't be enough, or something. I'm paraphrasing a bit now. But so I suppose people maybe are a bit sceptical as to whether technology can deliver all the progress that we need. I think it's really important that we do maintain our productive capacity for food. Like, we're the Agriculture and Food Development Authority. We're not the Emissions Reduction Authority. So for us, part of the journey is about maintaining this productive capacity and using the technologies, or developing the technologies that allow us to maintain that while meeting this emissions reduction challenge. But obviously, people from outside the sector are still, I suppose, feeling that, oh, well, you're going to have to diversify or go into new non-livestock type agriculture and so on. So that's the challenge we have, to convince them that we can develop the technologies, and we'll be looking to things like the vaccine and so on that are coming not just in Ireland but internationally to bring us along part of that journey.
Okay, we'll take maybe 2 more questions, just because we're a bit behind time. So over here, I think, with the hands up. Yeah, just wait till we get a mic to you, and Tommy.
Morris Keynes, Consulting. It's on a similar maybe note to John's point. Really, it's maybe taking up what the American person on the panel said, that incentive works better than regulation. So I suppose, is there an alignment really in terms of, call it, positive incentives? And I know we all know that budgets are limited, but to align, let's say, incentives, agree the behaviour, maybe it's back to Mike McGann's point, agree the behaviours required, and then try, and so far as possible with limited budgets, align those incentives to get the greatest support, if you like, to what the objective is. So is there more work required there, is the question really. And again, maybe is there a difference in approach in New Zealand to Ireland there?
Okay, who wants to take that? Thanks, Morris. And we have one more down there, I think, Tommy, around that area. There might be someone else. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Morris. Look, I agree with you completely. My Director General highlights the fact that we're the ministry for the primary industries. We're there to back the primary industries to win. You need regulatory bottom lines, because you'll always have the tragedy of the common, where the certain people won't want to get on board and everybody else will have to carry more weight. But our goal is that we work in partnership with the sector to achieve the outcomes we want to achieve, and we're the regulator of last resort. It should be the stick at the end of the tunnel rather than brought out first. So that is exactly our approach. The situation is different in New Zealand in that we don't have direct subsidies. We don't incentivize food producers in that way. And so that does put a slightly different lens on the paradigm you're describing. But I think you're right. We have an opportunity here. We are already, collectively, both countries, the lowest emitting producers of dairy products in particular, but also of red meat in the world, and the world needs our food. Now, so by leading in this initiative, because it's so important to both of our economies, we will be seen in an even better light by the shall we say, the artisan purchasers of the world rather than the bottom of the barrel commodity producer of the world. If I just want, for 1 second, Damien, I believe there's 3 pathways in the future of food. You've got the commodities that we produce really, really well, and we do it really, really high quality, but it's high volume, low price. It's always a race to the bottom. You have your molecular foods, that again are being developed, will be appetizing to some people, but again, will become commoditized. And if you think they're taking over the world, get out your iPhone and look at the share market and look up Beyond Meat. Last September, it was $112 a ton. You can buy it today for $20 a ton. The market is speaking, and real foods are still really important. And that brings me to my third one, and I believe it's modern regenerative foods. And we have done a lot of market analysis on this. The consumer is really interested in the concept of regenerative foods, but they don't know what it is. So let's tell them what it is. It's what we do, with disruption around the edges.
Okay, very good observation and analysis of that there. Frank, do you want to briefly just comment on that?
The core point about incentives being important, I absolutely agree with that, and that's why I think it's very encouraging to see sustainability bonus schemes being, coming into the industry, and I think we'll see that developing further over the coming years. And also, the point that Mike McGann made about kind of individual ownership, I think that is really important, that individual farmers understand what both their emissions but also their removals are, and that they start seeing that as a KPI for their farm, and how can I improve that situation. And I think we have to move in that direction, as fast as we can. The EU are saying we have to give everyone that information by 2028. I think we have to do it a lot sooner than that.
Right, okay. And one final question I think we might have down here.
Yeah, hello. John Carrigan from the Yield Lab. I'm just wondering how you plan to work with private sector technology providers going forward. So at the moment, around the world, there are companies that are actually providing carbon credits, have started selling carbon credits for farmers, advising farmers. One of the issues with investing in these companies, even though they're growing, is that we don't know if the emphasis is going to fall on the government to solve these problems, or the institutions, or the actual private sector. And that provides a kind of a funding uncertainty.
Yeah, Frank, do we need clarity on that?
Well, look, we already collaborate hugely with the private sector in 2 ways. One, they're partners in the Signpost programme in terms of this journey of supporting farmers to adopt technologies. But at the research level, we have a lot of talk in this country about the 3-NOP or the feed additives. Like that's developed by the private sector. We've worked with them in terms of evaluating it and so on, and we're working with them now in terms of trying to see how we can make it work in a pasture situation. John mentioned Vista Milk, which is the SFI funded centre around dairying, and that has evaluated a lot of products from the private sector that are being developed to try to reduce emissions. So there is a lot of interaction already with the private sector in terms of the whole carbon credit story. Look, probably don't have time enough to go into that, but that's an evolving story, I think, and there's huge uncertainty yet as to how those markets are going to develop here in the EU and in Ireland.
Okay, yeah, no, we could continue on, but obviously we have more sessions to come and more speakers as well. But I want to thank both of you and Robert earlier on for your input to this year's conference. Very timely and indeed very important as well. And enjoy the rest of your stay, John. So thank both of our speakers here for their time.